What is it about us human beings? We seem to be responsible for the very best and worst things on planet Earth. We have this insatiable desire and ability to invent and build and improve the world. The Colosseum, the Forum, the Pantheon, what spectacular achievements. And yet at what cost? I mean human labour. Think of the oppression required to build these. They were built on the backs of slaves. And think of the blood sports and the brutality that was celebrated here. You see what I mean? The very best and the very worst. Despite all our achievements and abilities, there's something fundamentally flawed with us human beings. Now, let's be honest, nothing's fundamentally changed in 2,000 years. You just have to turn on the news or scroll social media to realise there's something wrong with this world and with you and me. Now brace yourself, because in Romans 1-3, Paul gives a gritty, honest description of our underlying condition. He doesn't pull any punches. But when it's tough, don't lose hope. A good doctor gives an honest diagnosis of the patient because he wants to save them. The gospel is going to take us down because it wants to lift us up. And who knows, perhaps a more honest look at our underlying condition will be the very best thing for us. Welcome to episode 2.
Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. I commend to you our sister Phoebe. Welcome her in the Lord.
To all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be His holy people. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen.
So as we saw last time, Romans was addressed to secret house churches scattered across the ancient city of Rome. A wealthy businesswoman called Phoebe was tasked with bringing the letter to them, and then she would have read the whole thing in one sitting. So what we're doing, chopping it up into sections, is not ideal, especially this time as we consider the bad news a little bit in isolation from the larger story of Romans, which is such good news. So before we dive in, let's remind ourselves of our route map through Romans and where this episode fits into the bigger picture. Well, after introducing the gospel last time, Romans now takes us down to consider the problem of sin, and then seeing how Christ alone can lift us up through salvation. He brings us to a beautiful place of peace where we can rest, before then heading along the narrow ridge of freedom that leads to the summit of hope. Romans 8, panoramic views of God's great purpose. Then we'll enter the cloud of mystery, considering God's complex plan for Israel, before descending into more practical teaching. Romans 12, how can we live with devotion? Romans 13 and 14, how can we play our part in God's community? And finally, Romans 15 and 16, what is our onward mission? Romans will show us how to live all of life in view of God's mercy. In this episode, Paul considers huge themes from Genesis and the beginning of our human story, creation, the fall, judgment and hope. So take a deep breath. The first section of adventure is always tough for cold muscles, but trust me, the view will be worth it. Now you may remember some of those key phrases that we reached last time in Romans 1 verse 16 and 17, where Paul declared that the gospel is the power of God and that it reveals the righteousness of God. That's God's faithful intervention, remember, to save his people. Well, in the very next verse, Paul sets up a deliberate contrast between the righteousness of God and the wrath of God, which he now says is being revealed from heaven against ungodliness and wickedness. Wrath implies anger and judgment. It's a revelation of how God feels about all that ruins the world he's made. But don't interpret God's wrath as something wild or unhinged. He's not a drunken father flying off the handle. God's angry because he cares about all the brokenness, whether personal, social or environmental. Now in this sense, God's wrath is an extension of his love. God's judgment is a positive theme throughout the Bible story. However, in Romans 1, Paul unpacks this theme, the wrath of God, in a rather surprising way. He speaks of it in the present continuous tense. The wrath of God is being revealed. In a certain sense for Paul, judgment's already here, not just in the future. Right now, in ancient Rome and downtown London, wherever you live, God's wrath is being revealed. Now, in what sense is that true? How is God's wrath already being revealed? Well, to understand it, we now need to follow the three sections of Paul's argument: creation, sin, and judgment. Now, Paul echoes Genesis by beginning with God's self-disclosure in the natural world. Verse 20, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." As an artist reveals their personality on canvas, so God has expressed himself in creation. Untamable thunder displays the majesty of God. Magical sunsets, vibrant flowers, delicious food convey the beauty and generosity of God. He's not a miserable killjoy, but an extravagant creator who delights in colour and variety. And what's more, we've also been given a moral conscience that points to the existence of God. If you ask someone what's wrong with the world, all kinds of answers will be given. But everyone, secular atheist or religious fundamentalist, everyone assumes there is something wrong and that there is therefore a right way for the world to be. According to Romans, this moral compass of ours points to God, and as Paul says, that leaves people without excuse. God's existence, his fingerprints are all over the natural world and you and me. Now Romans 1:21-23 then traces what happens when humans reject what deep down they know to be true. 3 times Paul uses the word exchange, verse 23, verse 25, verse 26. It captures the extent of the problem. Sin's not just being a bit naughty or disrespectful. The deeper root of the problem is replacing God with false substitutes. And this is what the Bible calls idolatry. Ancient Rome was filled with temples. They were everywhere in the city. And this is what you did, you came to the temple and you offered a sacrifice to the gods. This is thought to be one of the oldest buildings that survived from ancient Rome. It's a temple. But in Romans 1, Paul squares up to this whole system and declares it bankrupt. He says in quite a challenging verse, verse 25, "They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped created things rather than the Creator." For Paul, these so-called gods were nothing but fake idols, substitutes for the real thing. But the good news is, we don't worship idols today. Or do we? Well, we may not have statues in our homes or sacrifice in temples, but what Paul has in mind runs much deeper. The key phrase is verse 25, they exchanged. Idolatry is swapping the real God for alternatives. And in this sense, our hearts are still prone to serving substitutes. We do actually still make sacrifices, but in our case, we sacrifice for significance, for security, for pleasure. Our hearts chase after other priorities, careers, lovers, properties, sports, academic achievements, holidays. The list goes on. Now, these things are good, but when we upgrade them into our gods, we cross the threshold of modern-day temples. In short, it's idolatry when we worship things that humans have made rather than the God who made humans. So according to Romans 1, idolatry is a symptom of rejecting God and replacing him with other dreams, goals and lovers. But here comes the twist. Just when we might think that God would stop wicked sinners in their tracks and smite them down, in fact, he opens the door, gives them what they want and lets them go. According to Paul, this is how the wrath of God is being revealed today. God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts, verse 24. Then in verse 26, Paul says, God gave them over to shameful lusts. The Greek word here is epithumia, which literally means over-desire. It's when you want something so much you become obsessed with it and controlled by it. In other words, it's addiction. It's bondage. It's being ruined by something you hoped would fulfill you. For Paul, this is how God's judgment is revealed, when he removes his restraining hand and leaves us exposed to the very things that dehumanize us. Now, in one of the more controversial passages in the Bible, Paul turns in Romans 1 to human sexuality as a kind of case study to illustrate his larger point. You know, the pattern of creation, sin, and judgment. You see, in the Bible, the story of creation from the very beginning affirms that sexual union is a good thing, a gift from God to be enjoyed by husband and wife, making love and forming families. But if you lived in ancient Rome, it was pretty obvious that something had gone horribly wrong. Orgies and brothels, rape and a real abuse culture, even older men sexually abusing boys. It was pretty obvious sex had turned dark. This is a Roman brothel token that archaeologists discovered outside Rome. It's so transactional, isn't it? I mean, a price for a body, a token for a sex act, intimacy reduced to a commodity. It's what happens when disordered desires take over. The divine gift is exchanged for dark lust, and the result is brokenness. Now, we still experience this today. In our culture, sex is more commodified than ever. Lives are plagued by abuse, pornography, and unfaithfulness. Unbridled lust runs riot, cheapening bodies and damaging lives. Now, this is Paul's point. Sin, including sexual sin, dehumanizes us. Now, to sum up this whole section of Romans 1, imagine a skilled craftsman fashioning a beautiful piece of wood into a violin. The wood has its own intricate grain or pattern, so the craftsman must work with the wood. The tools must go with the grain if they are to fashion an instrument that will bring music and joy and dancing to the room. You know, the world has been entrusted to us with a God-given pattern or grain. In the Bible, wisdom goes with the grain, but folly cuts against it. Our lives are not a piece of plastic we can just mould any way we please. We must go with the grain if we are to make music and joy. The message of Romans chapter 1 may have been hard to hear, but it's ultimately designed to help us rediscover the way of wisdom so that we can flourish. Ancient Rome was filled with pagan worship, but the hard-hitting message of Romans had an extraordinary impact. This is the beautiful church of San Clemente, which today is dedicated to the worship of Jesus Christ. But it wasn't always this way. Deep beneath the Christian church, there are layers of history that come right down to the 1st century. This was a family villa, a wealthy villa that would have been here when Phoebe brought Paul's letter to Rome. And along with a family living here, it also hosted a pagan temple. So this was a pagan temple, part of the Mithraic cult in the 1st century, which was very popular in Rome, and it worshipped false gods, but also encouraged various forms of immorality. But when the owners of this villa heard the good news of Jesus, they converted to Christianity. We don't know exactly when or how. Maybe it was through Paul's letter to the Romans. Either way, their conversion reminds us that the good news of Jesus, the gospel, could win hearts and minds right here in the pagan temples in Rome. I love this stone surface. It captures the incredible transformation that occurred right in this villa. On one surface is a pagan inscription, that's how things used to be, but they reused the stone. And on the other side is a Christian inscription as the family converted to Christ. What a beautiful symbol of the way the gospel can turn whole families and communities upside down. Now, as we continue through Romans chapter 1, it's got some tough teaching, it's hard to hear, but don't lose sight of where we're headed. This is the goal. The gospel delivers us from false idols and hopes and brings us to Jesus Christ, who helps us to flourish once again. That's the goal of Romans 1.
Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of our sin. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Now, if you remember, one of the big aims of Romans was to achieve unity between Jew and Gentile. Paul's rather unusual tactic to achieve this seems to be to offend everyone in equal measure. Imagine Phoebe reading the letter in a house church somewhere in Rome, as she described the downward slope of Gentile sin, idol worship, sexual immorality. Imagine the Jewish Christians. They must have been cheering. Yeah, sock it to those pork-eating, idol-worshipping, immoral pagans. But all the while, Paul was setting a trap that springs open in chapter 2. Verse 1, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself." If Romans 1 challenged unrighteous pagan types, Romans 2 turns on self-righteous religious types who think their good deeds put them in a different category. This would have included Jewish believers who may have thought that by observing the Torah, the law of Moses, circumcision, keeping the Sabbath special, food laws, that they would be exempt from the wrath of God. Though these ideas may be specific to the time, nevertheless today it's still relevant that many people assume their good works provide almost a get-out-of-jail-free card. After all, compared to Adolf Hitler or Osama bin Laden or those terrible people I've just cancelled on social media, we're the good people, aren't we? Well, Romans pulls the rug from under religious feet. Paul condemns this attitude as hypocrisy. You who pass judgment, do the same things, verse 3. As someone brought up in a Christian home who's never been arrested by the police, I can easily fall into this trap. Whenever I smugly compare myself and judge others, I fail to consider all the ways I've failed to live up to God's standards, even though I've actually had so many privileges and good influences. With this in mind, Paul poses a question that every one of us has to reflect on. Do you think that you will escape God's judgment? With Jew and Gentile now equally offended, it must have felt awkward as Phoebe read on into chapter 3. Rather like a prosecutor in a court of law, Paul now takes both Jew and Gentile by the hand and brings them before the judge. There he imagines, verse 19, every mouth silenced in the light of this perfect justice that cannot be evaded. Then, in the role of prosecutor, Paul gives a summing up speech and declares, verse 23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In a Roman court of law, if the defendant had nothing left to say in their defense, they would put their hand over their mouth as a sign of resignation. This is the place Paul is trying to get us to. If we're still wriggling with excuses, comparisons, or counter-arguments, then perhaps we need to read Romans 1-3 again. You see, ironically, it's only once we've given up that we're ready to move on. Only when we've resigned ourselves to the bad news, I'm guilty, only then are we ready for the good news. Now, let's sit back for a moment and reflect on Paul's tough teaching. What does all this mean for us today? Well, firstly, an honest diagnosis of our real condition can cultivate humility. Remember what we said earlier, a good doctor exposes the problem because they want to save the patient and restore them to health. With this in mind, there's something refreshingly honest about Paul's blunt verdict, Romans 3:23. There's no difference, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Notice the word all. There aren't good people and bad people. We're all on the same page here. Our problems can't be solved by more science and education. It runs much deeper than that. We're not naturally progressive or on an upward curve. In ever more sophisticated ways, we actually are continuing the same pattern, exchanging the real God for fake substitutes that dehumanize us. Now, imagine if everyone owned this truth for themselves. I mean, don't you think there'd be a lot less pride, boasting, discrimination, and hypocrisy in the world? That's why I believe this hard teaching is actually good for us, a kind of pleasing pain that cultivates greater honesty and humility. After all, so much religion is superficial, putting on your Sunday best, saying I'm fine and acting like the good guys. But if we embrace this truth, that we're by nature sinners, we can be more honest. After all, what have we got to hide? We're sinners, aren't we? It's only my pride that prevents me from opening up and being more real. Instead, Romans can help us then to cultivate deeper, more authentic relationships. You know, the hard truth, all have sinned, is actually a great foundation for honest, authentic relationships. Now, secondly, this honest diagnosis of our condition reveals the power of the gospel. It's easy to assume that the world is getting worse, the youth of today are more wicked than ever. But Romans actually encourages a more positive, optimistic view. If Paul can say, in the face of all the wickedness of ancient Rome, the gospel's the power of God for salvation, then so can we. Humans today, they're no worse, and the gospel is certainly no less powerful. Romans then is not encouraging pessimism or giving permission to sit back and moan about how terrible society's become. Quite the opposite. The darker culture becomes, the brighter the gospel shines. A few years ago, having decided to ask Charlotte to marry me, I needed to get an engagement ring. So I went to the jeweller's near where she lived and browsed some options in the cabinet. When I finally found one I liked, I asked to view it. However, before the jeweller took the ring out of the cabinet, he first spread out a black velvet cloth on the counter. Only then did he set down the ring onto the counter so the diamond sparkled on the black. Romans 1-3 has laid out a dark backdrop, but now Paul is ready to bring out the diamond of the gospel so that we can see it sparkle.